Presenting Benny Goodman and his music.
Hey, everybody. I'm off to a bit of a late start for a Sunday. Hey, Dina. Hey, Luann, Octavio. Hey, Ed.
Benny Goodman, ladies and gentlemen, the man with the torrid clarinet and the even more torrid band who purveys assorted rhythms, all danceable, in the urban room of the Congress Hotel in Chicago.
Hey, Sarah. Hey, Gladys.
Berlin's greatest hit.
Morning, Bob.
Blue
Hey,
Sky.
Gene. I just burned my tongue a bit. That's all right. I'll live. Hey, Kathy. Hey, Pam. Morning, Todd. Parking lot church. That's interesting. The Lord will save you a parking space. He'll save your soul, but will he save you a space? There's got to be a better punch for this. Hey, Karen. What if you could parallel park a donkey? Ah, Scott Hugh. I remember him from Snellville. Hey, Lisa. Hey, Keely. The secret to parallel parking is believing you can do it. Watch out, I'm going to wipe this thing off a little bit. I think I'm a little bit blurry. There we go. Boker Tov, Lisa. Ambassador. Ambassador. Konnichiwa. Lani Ishte. Running through all of my Hebrew. Hey, Gwendolyn in sunny Maryland. Hey, Leah, hey, Carol. Morning, Kelly. Rebecca and sunny Juliet. Everybody else set for the walking tour this afternoon?
Benny Goodman presents Helen Ward singing
Octavia, I do not have the backup camera. Which is tricky. These hatchbacks, it's very hard to gauge. Depth perception, spatial awareness. They're a little bit tricky, the hatchback. Hey, Kieran. With all my heart. I know Bob's ready. I just realized I've still got the permission form sitting up on my desktop. May have to just bet my way out of this one this afternoon. I'll do what I always do. Talk my way out of it. To say again, I love you with all my heart. George, was that you on WGN last night who kept drowning us out with The Cure? Yesterday I was researching a guy at Trinity Church who was captain of a ship and upon landing in New York attempted to kill one of his passengers in a sword fight because the passenger was singing a song he didn't like. Probably Just Like Heaven by The Cure. That was the passenger story. He ended up getting killed by the passenger. It was more likely more of a duel than just an attack. And probably there was more to it than just him singing a song on the ship. I also just found a guy who was known as a quick wit. One day he was at the Tyler White House. And one of Tyler's daughters that he knew from New York back in the day came up to him and said, "Isn't it weird that I've married into a family with so many large noses? I've brought the pug nose to the Tyler family." And he said, "You always were pugnacious even when you were a kid." The reporter noted that no one laughed because it was such a bad pun. But I love it when I can find like somebody's favorite jokes or examples of songs they sang or jokes they told.
Benny Goodman goes away back and gets a
George, I did see The Cure's fight with Ticketmaster, and I'm for it.
Benny Goodman and his orchestra.
Hey, which tour should we do when the Grateful Dead are in town? Logically, it would be Graceland, but I feel like it would wreck parking, so maybe we should just go up to Rose Hill. Bring your vans. Morning, everybody. I'm surprised no cat has come running in yet. Well, Priya's on the couch. We're going to let Benny Goodman finish up this tune, and then we'll get started properly. So I got up to a bit of a later start, so the music is all out of whack. Morning, Grace. Lily is doing really well. I'm figuring out what kind of treats she likes and doesn't like. Gary. See, that's what happens when we start a little bit late. People who are straggling in show up on time after all. Suge, yeah, I have a tour about Al Capone. I'm a Chicago tour guide. I gotta have one of those in my back pocket. But it's tricky because I then spend an hour fielding questions from people who want me to talk about Capone's resort in their hometown, which probably did not exist. And they really do not want to hear that it probably did not exist, but it's something every Chicago tour guide notes is that after so many tours, people will come and say, "Oh yeah, I'm from Rectum, Nebraska. I'm sure you know all about that. That's where Capone had his resort."
And they all loved it. They all loved those
all right.
when they played by Benny Goodman. And now another one just in the same vein, Rosetta.
All right, we will wait out Rosetta by Benny Goodman. I think it is time that we go ahead and get started here. So, welcome along, everybody. I'm Adam from Mysterious Chicago Tours. I have been a tour guide and historian here in Chicago for going on 20 years now. Among my books are Graceland Cemetery, Chicago Stories, Symbols, and Secrets. You can pick up a copy of that this afternoon on my Graceland walking tour, 1 p.m., Graceland Cemetery. Details are all still up at adamchicago.com. Several years ago, I also did a book. This was just a contract gig. It's a whole series, but I did the Chicago entry, Jerks in Chicago History. It was an interesting weekend project. I don't think, well, this one I took a little more than a weekend on, I think. It was the other one I did for this company that I did in exactly one weekend. After procrastinating a lot. I'm also occasionally on television, WGN just last night, so I am incredibly famous, and you should definitely pay attention to everything that I say, especially when I judge these people to be jerks. Now, I am really rather generous with cutting people historical slack. Nobody's perfect. People lived in completely different times than we do. They were raised to believe totally different things than we do. They wouldn't have been exposed to as many perspectives, etc., 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 but the bottom line is some people were just jerks. So, to start with, there was at one point when I was doing the Graceland Cemetery book, I was organizing geographically. I realized there was one stretch where I really didn't have anybody, so I was just looking up person after person, and found that one of the people there was former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. I'll put myself up here. Here we have Melville Weston Fuller. Melville Fuller was the guy up in the previous picture. Here is a picture of him with a fantastic walrus mustache. I will absolutely give him the fantastic walrus mustache. Throughout the early 1860s, he was a state legislator and opponent of Abraham Lincoln. He was voting against things like more provisions for wounded soldiers because he wanted to just end the war and let the South go off and do what they wanted to. By some reports, he was deeply against slavery. He wrote essays in college about the evils of slavery, but he was one of those guys who may not have exactly liked slavery, but he hated abolitionists more. Like one of those guys is like, well, I don't really like Donald Trump, but I hate liberals too much to not vote for him. One of those kind of guys. He said that slavery was just the inert material. If that was the start of the war, then the cause was the people who lit the match to the inert material, and that would be the abolitionists. Now, the Chicago Tribune predicted at the time of his voting against that bill that his political career was over, and yet he ended up becoming Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. In his term, he ruled that Native Americans did not count as citizens, so therefore we could break treaties with them without notice, and also oversaw the ruling of Plessy versus Ferguson, which established separate but equal. It is very difficult to think of too many Supreme Court rulings that did more damage to people than that particular one. But here's where this gets amusing to me, is he happened to die on the same day that Jack Johnson, the boxer, buried not far from here, was having a fight. It's difficult to overstate what a big deal boxing was in people's imaginations in the late 19th and early 20th century. So, this is the Chicago Daily Inter-Ocean the next day. Off to the side, Justice Fuller dead. Then the big picture of Johnson going like this, as though he's like celebrating the fact that Fuller is dead. This actually came up on a number of newspapers at the time. Chief Justice Fuller passes away. Johnson, undisputed heavyweight champion of the world. Chief Justice Fuller dead. Champion Johnson. This just amuses me to no end. There is still a school in Bronzeville named after this guy, which just irks me to no end. They've taken down statues of him in his hometown in Maine. I couldn't find one really nice thing to say about this guy, except he let his daughter pursue her career in music. That's all right. We'll move on up from here. Who I got over here? This is up in the corner. Up in the corner, there's an unmarked space at Graceland for a guy by the name of William Drossel, who accidentally shot himself to death while he was trying to murder his wife. Oops. Here's the thing. Apparently, he had tried to murder his wife several times by this point. It's like, how incompetent was this guy? Not only did he kill himself instead of the intended target, but also this shouldn't be that complicated. Pickpocketing takes some apprenticeship. You have to learn how to pick a pocket. Murder, take heavy object, apply brute force. This shouldn't be that hard. But he had left a note. He knew that he might not survive this. I think the plan was to do a murder-suicide sort of thing. He had left a note saying he wished to be buried at Graceland Cemetery. I was really kind of surprised that his relatives actually did. I would have just dumped him someplace, personally. Let's move on elsewhere in Graceland. Graceland is such a lovely cemetery, but all cemeteries have heroes and villains. You know, the lawnmower passes over the just and the unjust. This is one of the unjust, Henry Rhines, who actually died several years before Graceland was founded. He would have been at the Old City Cemetery initially. Don't have a picture of this guy. I'm kind of okay with that. Henry Rhines was an early police officer in the city. He made the arrest of the first man convicted of murder, John Stone, in 1840, which could establish him as a place in Chicago history, but most of the time he was a member of like a 3-person police force at the time. And for the most part, he was just using his office to harass people that he thought might be refugee enslaved people who were escaping from the South. In the 1840s, he did not really have any authority to do this. It was just how he spent his time. Sometimes he would go up to Wisconsin to harass and arrest people that he thought were escaping. There was one fantastic story from when he was off the force briefly, but Captain Walker of the Great Western, a ship that was used often on the Underground Railroad, Captain Walker was known to look the other way and somehow not notice that as he sailed away from Chicago, he had several more black crewmen. And also not to notice when suddenly he didn't have them anymore after they docked in Detroit across the river from Ontario, across the water from Ontario. But Henry Rhines accosted him on the shore when he was about to sail away. He came up and said, "Do you know that you have 3 slaves on board your ship?" And Captain Walker said, "Are you, in fact, a police officer, and have you any authority to stop me here?" And Rhines confessed that he did not, at which point the captain said, "Well, then you, sir, are a damned rascal," and sailed away, leaving people like Philo Carpenter and Charles Volney Dyer cheering on the shore while Henry Rhines went off to cry in his cereal. Now, later on, he actually did some time in jail himself. He had arrested somebody, a friend objected to him having arrested him, so he shot that friend, and he later died. Rhines was put in jail, escaped to New Orleans, and then was captured and brought back, somehow managed to get a pardon. I've got some paperwork on it now, but I haven't really incorporated it into the story yet. Somehow they got the governor to let him off of the hook, and he was back at his job a couple of years later, back at what he thought was his job, after the fugitive slave law had been passed, which at least nominally gave him some sort of authority here. In any case, died in 1852. His son became a famous billiard player. Police officers like this have a long history in Chicago, of course. Out here at Forest Home Cemetery by the interstate is Reuben Slayton. His name rhymes with Satan. 1867, he chased down a guy who was running away from a fortune-telling parlor that got raided. The man Henry Harris was not actually wanted for anything, but Officer Slayton just saw a black man running and beat him to death. He was given a short suspension for that, but was still on the force about 20 years later when he arrested one of the people who was eventually hanged for his supposed involvement in the Haymarket affair. The Haymarket affair, of course, started with trouble over at the McCormick plant. This would have been after Cyrus McCormick's time. But I love ripping on Silas McCormick. There's Marshall Field, widely attributed to be the guy who first said, "The customer is always right." Some people say the full quote was supposed to be "in matters of taste." But I think when Marshall said it, it was just, "Let customers walk all over you. You're just employees. You don't matter." He would justify paying his employees very little wages by saying, well, if they just save 10 cents a week, they'll have, in a few years, that's a couple $1,000s. Like, yeah, in 250 years. Math is hard, Marshall. But here, in this wide wilderness stretching all the way to the next road over, is the family plot of Cyrus McCormick. Well, that's Cyrus H. McCormick, who was running the plant when the Haymarket people were killed. But Cyrus himself, his dad, was a guy that I can't get enough of ripping on. He was the inventor of the mechanical reaper. His brothers say that really their father invented it. He just kind of took all the credit and made it famous. But this allowed for farms to be much easier to harvest. This eliminated the work of lots and lots of people. Now, initially, he had built it with help from a man that he enslaved named Joe Anderson. Now, there are those who even say Joe was the proper inventor. He probably just helped with the blacksmithing part of it. There's not really a lot of evidence one way or the other. On his grandson.
Undaunted by such cynicism and encouraged by the faith of his friends, McCormick persevered. With his only helper, the faithful servant Joe Anderson, he fitted each piece, bit by bit, as gradually a basic part took shape. The knife blade on which he worked was to be propelled forward through the grain, cutting it with a side-to-side motion. Out of this sliding cutting bar evolved a principle which has since been embodied in all successful harvesting machines.
Gripping film. Excellent direction. But he had to move up to Chicago because in his native Virginia there was not a lot of call for farm labor-saving devices back at the time. But once set up in Chicago, Mr. McCormick also bought the Chicago Herald, which he used as a vehicle to espouse absolutely frothing at the mouth white supremacy. Now, he didn't write the articles himself, his political editor did, but it was definitely set up to serve as his mouthpiece. Now, among his sons, we already talked about Cyrus H. McCormick for a second. There was also Harold Fowler McCormick, who left his wife, Edith Rockefeller, for an opera singer of questionable talents, and to prepare for the new marriage, underwent an operation in which he had either goat, human, or gorilla balls implanted into himself. This made quite a bit of news at the time. The wife actually said that it worked a little too well. Now, not everybody in the family was known to be a jerk. This is Stanley, who was Stanley, his son, who spent most of his life in an asylum. It wasn't his fault, though most people who knew the whole family said that that part of it, the insanity, came from Nettie, his wife, who was much, much younger than Cyrus and possibly the only person who could ever actually stand him. What have I got set up over here? Yes, and the Pinkerton plot would be some of the people who killed the Haymarket guys at the McCormick plant. Wouldn't have been Allen himself. Allen's writings do have a certain contempt for unions, but the anti-union Pinkerton stuff was mostly after his time. But elsewhere in the cemetery is a whole other plot for Cyrus's brothers. They couldn't be buried together because they hated each other's guts. This is one point where I agree with them. They were right to hate each other's guts. They all sucked. This was William McCormick, who stopped going to church because they were preaching abolitionist sermons, and he did not approve of that. And over to the right is Leander McCormick, who was a good friend of Robert E. Lee, and whose son wrote the book Characterology, which expanded on phrenology to include things like skin color as something that could tell you all about a person. You can probably tell where he was going with that. Now let's move to a one-off cemetery. Just one single monument out here on the outskirts of Bronzeville to the lake. Near the soldiers' home, rising above the trees, is the monument to Stephen A. Douglas. Now, Stephen A. Douglas was the other half of the Lincoln-Douglas debates. And on the inside of his tomb here, you can actually see the sarcophagus. They got brochures about him set up on the sarcophagus, which I always thought was delightfully tacky. Now, Douglas was the guy who introduced the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Prior to the 1850s, slavery had been cut off below the southern border of Missouri. He decided that new territories like Kansas and Nebraska ought to be able to vote as to whether to have slavery or not, which led to people forming militias to make sure they became slave states at any cost. Ended up debating with Lincoln famously in 1858, but a few years before that, he came to Chicago to promote the Kansas-Nebraska Act and was refused a hearing. People tried to shout him down. People threw produce at him. There was a riot in which everybody got away with somebody else's hat. This is an interesting thing. The Springfield newspaper was very conservative at the time. And they said, this is the freedom of speech which the minions of sectionism boast is one of their sacred articles of faith, and which these peculiar political moralists and reformers have abused us all harp on. In the name of freedom, they have insulted and followed to his home with groans the man who has done more in the halls of the country for their city and for the entire state than any other man that can be named. The people who assembled in thousands to applaud the ravings of Frederick Douglass denied a hearing to the white Senator Douglas as the representative of the state in the National Senate. This is very similar to, like, how dare they harass Marjorie Taylor Greene at a restaurant, etc. You see a lot of the same stuff repeated in these things from the 1850s. Just a lot. Douglas called on people to give up all isms. Slavery has now taken up Stephen A. Douglas, and he has stooped lower and eaten more dirt than any man in the North. Let us discard him. Abolish the past, look to the future. Act together for principle, give up all isms, and oppose slavery. Good sentiment. Well, this is one of the reactions to the Lincoln-Douglas debates. The papers at the time were exceptionally partisan. Nobody, people who like to imagine that there was some time in history when newspapers just gave you the facts, not opinions, are absolutely fooling themselves. Like, here's one account of a Lincoln-Douglas debate from, I believe, the Ottawa debate in the Chicago Times, which I think at the time was run by McCormick. It went through a couple of hands around then. The battle fought and won. Lincoln's heart fails him. Lincoln's legs fail him. Lincoln's tongue fails him. Lincoln's arms fail him. Lincoln fails all over. The people refuse to support him, and the people laugh at him. Douglas, the champion of the people. And the pro-Lincoln papers would have been saying pretty much the same stuff about Douglas about the same debate. Once again, we'll just take a look on the inside there. There's his sarcophagus with brochures about him on top of it. Now, one thing we'll say in Douglas's favor is that when he realized midway through the 1860 campaign that Lincoln was going to win, and basically quit campaigning to go try to persuade the South to talk some sense into the South. Didn't work, but it was a nice try. Died shortly thereafter before he could redeem himself further, as he might have done. Quite a few people who had been awful in the 1850s got their heads together in the 1860s. And nearby here, over at one of the other guys associated with him, the guy who was standing with him on the bench as he made the speech that got him pelted with produce, right where the courthouse is now, was a guy by the name of Ike Cook, who was right here. He was a local politician. In the speeches that followed, he told everybody a quote that would follow him forever, a quote that was frequently brought up, which was, "Truth squashed to earth will always rise again." That's a very good line, except that the truth he was talking about was not the truth. This was him supporting Douglas's crap at the time. Now, Louis Isbell, a barber in Chicago, who claimed to be the first black man in Chicago. He wasn't exactly, but it made a good story. Later in life, he told a lot of stories about how he was actually pretty good friends with Douglas, but right after that speech, Douglas came in to get a haircut, and he really gave him what for. I really hope it's true. It's kind of unclear how many of Isbell's stories are just old man stories. I'm sure quite a few of them were. Elsewhere at Graceland, right up at the front here. I'll move myself a little. Right up at the front, this has recently been cleaned. It looks very nice right now. This is Eli B. Williams. I couldn't find a lot of good stuff about Eli B. Williams. He was a financier and businessman, finance guy. One story I did find was when he first came to Chicago, his wife made him switch hotels because there were Indians in the lobby, and that freaked her out. I decided just not to put it in the book. Sometimes the best I can really do is just say, you know what, you don't get to be in the book. But Wilbur F's story was just such a weirdo that I'll talk about him and talk about him. This was the guy who ran the Chicago Times during the Civil War, the anti-Lincoln paper, the guy who said that it was, the Gettysburg Address was the silly, flat, and dishwatery utterances of an unintelligent man, and that the Emancipation Proclamation was the most wicked deed in the annals of history. When he went to one of his reporters went to the soldiers' home and got chewed out, he made a whole big thing about how these abolitionists were so intolerant. Very similar to nowadays, whenever somebody punches a Nazi and you see people go, "Oh, how tolerant." Guess the hand gesture I'm making here. Later on, he claimed that Lincoln had definitely cheated in the election, believed that everything was a false flag, everything was a conspiracy. But he did publish one of the more interesting headlines in Chicago history, "Jerked to Jesus," about a hanging. It wasn't even a Chicago hanging, he just liked to talk about hangings. "I have promised Rose Hill Cemetery that I would stop dancing on this guy's grave." Let's see. We'll keep on moving here. This is one we're still kind of working on. It's kind of impossible to find the exact location of a burial space for Johann Hock, but it's somewhere around here at Elmwood Cemetery, out in the west suburbs. Johann Hock, of course, was the guy who, when he was arrested in 1905, they think he had already proposed to what would have been wife number 55. This guy would meet a woman, charm her with his zither playing, propose to her, marry her, and take her money, all in the space of about a week. And in about a third of the cases, he's also known to have killed them. I think he killed about 5 people, usually with arsenic poisoning. Had a different persona. Everybody who knew him as somebody different. In one marriage, he was known as a very pious religious guy. The other one, he's like, "We're not getting married by a church. I can't stand the church. I can't stand all of this old-fashioned religious garbage." Actually lived for a while in Pullman. Here's a picture that Kristen took of the house which he lived in, which is still standing today. Now, he was eventually hanged. His wife, his last wife, whose sister he had murdered before marrying her, was spent all day going around from cemetery to cemetery trying to find one that would take him. Later, she married again and was taken to court by her new husband on the grounds that she had beaten him with a chicken. I kind of think she was in on her sister's murder. I can't figure it out for sure. Let's talk a little bit about some mayors. We've sure had our share of jerk mayors in Chicago. Best of luck to the new guy. Kristen, I didn't know you made an NFT out of that. Over here, well, first of all, we've got Mr. Big Bill Thompson Sr., who had one of the most fabulous sets of facial hair ever seen in the city of Chicago. But also his son, Big Bill, the Builder. Big Bill Thompson was mayor of Chicago for a couple of stints in the 1910s and the 1920s and made a complete goon of himself. A favorite of all of the gangsters, fabulously corrupt. At one point, he announced a debate with his opponents, but instead of actually debating them, he just bought rodents in cages with his opponents' names on them. Had a big thing about banning all books that he thought were too British and promised that if elected, he would one day punch the King of England in the snoot. Makes sense when you notice he was trying to go for the Irish vote in Chicago. But when he was finally voted out, I could never really talk about this guy without bringing up a bit of the Chicago Tribune's farewell to him. They were a Republican paper. He was a Republican mayor. But it is unpleasant business to eject a skunk, but someone has to do it. He made Chicago a byword for the collapse of American civilization. As it attempts to continue this, he excelled himself as a liar and defamer of character. He's out. He is not only disout, but he is dishonored. He is deserted by his friends. He is permanently marked by the evidence of his character and conduct. His health is impaired by his ways of life, and he leaves office and goes from the city the most discredited man who ever held place in it. Some other mayors in Chicago. We've got Levy Boone over at Rose Hill Cemetery. Levy Boone was initially a doctor in Chicago and actually pushed for more hospitals during the cholera epidemic, but came to believe that cholera spread because there were so many immigrants in Chicago. In the 1850s, he became mayor under the Know Nothing Party ticket. After the Kansas-Nebraska Act, all of the parties kind of split up. Before then, there were pro and anti-slavery people in both of the sides, both the Republicans and the Whigs. After that, really, it kind of became you were either pro-Kansas or anti-Kansas. The Whig Party broke up. Some of them splintered off into the Know-Nothings, who got their name because they were so secretive about it. If they were asked about their platform, they were just supposed to say, "I know nothing." But it was well known that they were rabidly anti-Catholic, they were rabidly anti-immigrant, rabidly anti-Freemason. Levy Boone tried to close down the taverns on Sunday in Chicago, leading to widespread riots. There's a rumor that he left people stranded on the old swing bridges, though that wasn't written down until years and years later. Later, he got in some trouble for aiding the Confederates and at Camp Douglas during the Civil War. But not as much trouble as Buckner Stith Morris, who was buried in an unmarked grave a little ways away from here. Buckner Stith Morris was the second mayor of Chicago, and during the Civil War actively plotted against the Union. He was quoted as being the first guy ever to use the phrase "hell in a handbasket." But specifically, he said that if they could break out the prisoners from Camp Douglas and take over the city, we could send those abolitionists to hell in a handbasket. He was arrested for treason and put on trial. Really, I think should have been convicted, but they decided that every time he had to do something that was actively illegal, he made his wife do it. So he just has to suffer some occasional indignities now. Who else we got? One thing I have generally been noting lately, I've been doing work on Trinity and St. Paul's cemeteries in New York. They have a lot more pirates than we do. Just a lot more. By the time people started being buried in Chicago in any great numbers, the golden age of piracy was over. Also, we lacked access to the high seas in general, but we do have Captain Streeter. Captain George Wellington Streeter, whose own story was that one day he crashed his houseboat into Chicago while attempting to sail down to South America on a gun-running trip. He said there was a terrible storm at sea that washed him up onto the shore, at which point he started charging people money to dump their garbage around his boats. Now, the city was already filling in the land on the shore to make Lakeshore Drive. Really, he was just kind of collecting money, and then using some forged maps claimed that he owned this land, and not only that he owned it, but that it was his own independent country of which he was the emperor. Took the cops 30 years to get rid of the guy, and it wasn't just legal battles either. He was always up for a good legal battle. There are a couple of people at Graceland Cemetery whom he claimed to be secretly the uncle of or something. Like anybody, if he found the name Potter somewhere in his family tree, he'd go off and harass the Potter family. He had a whole thing with the Lyon family. Also, at least killed one police officer. His army of hobos did any number of amount of damage. Now, at one point, this is kind of clever on his part. At one point, the city banned him from living on the district. So what he did was he just put his ship up on the back of a truck, effectively inventing the automobile motorhome. At the time, there were basically no parking restrictions, so he could just go park. Who else we got here? Here's a guy I just enjoy. I don't know if I'd really call this guy a jerk so much as a potty mouth. But over here in the Morrison plot at Graceland is Captain E.W. Morrison, who was known as the Millionless Millionaire. When he inherited a whole bunch of money, he decided to move back to Chicago, give up the sea, and just spend it. This made him an easy mark for tricksters. These are two young women he was kind of pressured into adopting on the grounds that he might have been their real father. Definitely was not really, but for a while they managed to mooch off him for a bit. Also, people could knock on his door and say, Captain Morrison, last night you got drunk and trashed my tavern and did $10,000 worth of damage. Pay up. And he would, because he didn't remember where he was that night anyway. He was also known by the Tribune as the most eloquent blasphemer this side of Brimstone Junction. Occasionally, newspaper articles couldn't quote a single word he said. It would just be dashes, 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 covering up the profanity. Love it. Have I skipped over anybody in here? I'm kind of rambling through. I gotta save my voice for this afternoon, after all. So we'll do one more. Just briefly, this is Frances Pierce Stone. She wasn't a jerk that I know of. But she was married to H.O. Stone, who was about 40 when he met her on a trip to his hometown in New York. She was 16. He married her and took her back. She died shortly thereafter. He went to Europe to grieve, then went back to his hometown, found somebody else to marry. Let's just say H.O. Stone got older and older. His bride stayed the same age. Yes, they did. But all right, I do have to save my voice for this afternoon, 1 p.m., Graceland Cemetery. There's still 2 or 3 tickets left, I think. Be there or be Candy, be squared. I have gone ahead and listed one for Thursday night. We're going to do Unsolved Mysteries from Chicago History. I realized I haven't done that one in a really long time. It's been like over a year since we did that one. And of course, this afternoon, Graceland Cemetery. My schedule is so wonky right now with some New York trips and everything going on in Cleveland right now that it's very difficult for me to schedule stuff, but I'm trying to do the best that I can. Thanks everybody who's been following along as well as they can. Thanks everybody who's been helping out with the Venmo, with the Patreon, or of course the the PayPal works as well. I ain't that picky about how people want to send me money. So, interesting. Been a while since I did this one too. But all right, everybody, with that, I will put the Benny Goodman back on and go find the cats in a second. There we go. Thanks, Dina. Usually it starts at bugle call rag, but usually I start a bit earlier than I did today. I've still managed to do 10 o'clock tours, I think, every day. Including some in some very interesting locations, getting to go to some news places. Working on getting this week's Patreon posts up as well. Susan, yep, I tweeted about that. The creator of the show said I had a good eye. Once again, if you have not been listening to, if you have not picked up the Muppets Mayhem, the Electric Mayhem's album, this is a great rock and roll album. Not even like a great novelty album, this is just plain a great album. Cool gatefold cover, too. And a trippy kaleidoscope on the back. Well, lately, I've never been much of a Deadhead. I tend to be of the sort who thinks they do great 3-minute songs, but then they play them for 20 minutes. Lately, those long Dead jams are all I want to listen to. Come to discover you are the eyes of the world. I don't know, maybe it just finally clicked with me or what. But I'm seeing these shows online. It's like a 19-minute version of Shakedown Street. Yes, sign me up. Heather, it's just called the Electric Mayhem. And don't just look up Mayhem. That's one of those true Norwegian black metal bands. Goodness, they were bad.
Music by Benny Goodman is being presented from the Joseph Urban Room of the Congress Hotel.
I gotta tell you, I was so amazed listening to Time Out of Mind and surround sound the other day on Mike's. I was like, how do I get one of these surround sound setups? What would this cost me? Be a few bucks. All right, it's a 1 p.m. tour today, Bob. So You're meeting me that early. I should really do something for lunch, though. I gotta get on archive while I'm thinking about it and see if anything comes up with this guy's lost poetry books that I just found at Graceland. Well, I found a portrait of him. So that's good. He doesn't just look like everybody else there either. Let's see. Alright, I didn't find one of his poetry books. I wonder if it's any good. Oh, it's long. Sudden my wayward footsteps pause, by sympathetic impulse wooed, spellbound by ethereal cause, a misanthrope of solitude. Arrested moody muse to gaze on portrait of the olden days, portrait as chronicles do tell of woman beyond mortal praise, surpassing exquisite, a belle, celestial in the sunset rays, stamped genius by their power sublime, cheating the ivied throes of time, that moth of ages strives in vain, dust, rust, or mildew want to stain, still fresh to nature magic art, she almost from the frame doth start. Hey, not bad. I know he wrote some kind of satirical thing about James Buchanan, too. That's probably a ripping yarn.
That was the bugle call rag, Benny Goodman's own arrangement. Now, the popular tune, Thanks a Million.
I'm trying to see just how unusual it was that Elizabeth Hamilton, Eliza, was buried there. So officially, they'd stopped burials there like 30 years before. But there was once again a periodic thing where people were planning to expend some streets and just cut right through the graveyard. Every time they did that, Trinity would have a high-profile monument or burial come up. Yesterday I went through lengthy debates about whether 1822 debates about whether disgusting churchyards were causing the yellow fever. Quite a lot of drama. There were actually people in town who said, I live right by that cemetery. I never smelled anything. But everybody had an agenda, of course. Octavio, it depends on the weather. Kristen, yes. I'm hoping June or July I'll get that one up.
Down Harlem Way, they're all trucking. And here's Helen Ward to tell you all about her. Trucking.
all over town. Yeah, let's not do any murdering of Christians. I only do that in dreams. And your dreams, not mine. Alright, well, I'm starting to feel as though it is lunchtime, but once again, still a few tickets left for this afternoon. I do have to find the cats. Let's see. Miles, you gotta show up.
Benny Goodman presents On the Alamo.
Here's the man himself. There's my boy. Alright, Miles has fulfilled his contract. Lily is hiding out someplace. I don't know where she is. I have an idea. Lily, I think, is probably either behind a bed or behind a couch, though she does come out quite a lot these days. But alright, everybody, I gotta rest my voice for the tour in a couple of hours. So I will see you all soon. Until then, I'm Adam from Mysterious Chicago Tours, telling everybody to stay safe and stay strong. And of course, if humanly possible, stay spooky, everybody.